Hello, everyone. I want to share Genesis chapter 16 today. In chapter 15, 16, God continuously affirm his promise. But today I want to think about the gap between the reality and God's promise. God promised Abram to give him a son and a big land. However, my question is, how do you think when you think God's promise is unrealistic based on your reality? What do you think about a gap between the possibility in your reality and God's promise? God's promise here is in chapter 15, verse 4 to 5 said that, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heavens and number the stars. If you are able to number them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. This is God's promise about his son. However, Abraham's reality is this. Abram had no son yet, though he is old enough. His wife Sarai was barren. Also, Sarai had a female servant, Hagar. So when we just look at Abram's reality, we can think, oh God, your promise is unrealistic. How can you make it possible? We can ask God like that. In unrealistic promise, Sarah decided like this. 16 verse 1 to 3. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had come borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. So what we can see, God clearly promised that this man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. Though Abram was very old enough, God promised him that you will have a son from you. However, Sarai's choice is that Sarah insisted Abram to take Hagar for his offspring, though it was not God's way. God didn't told Abram that, oh, you will get a son from other ladies, not Sarai. God just told him that your very own son shall be your heir. It means Abram and Sarai will have their own son, not from Hagar, but Sarah's choice is like this. It was not God's way. So what happened when Sarai attempted to solve God's promise by her strategy? Sarai got her from Hagar because she thought Hagar disrespectfully treated her. Also, Sarai felt wrath and abused Hagar. She seemed to struggle from low self-esteem for having no son. I could understand Sarai's feeling. However, when she attempted to solve God's promise to make it possible or to make it realistic by her strategy, not by God's will or God's way or God's timing, she suffered unnecessarily. So both Abram and Sarai need to pay attention to God's details. Abram should tell her God's promise written in Genesis chapter 15, verse 4 to 5. Is that right? That's not God's way. We should wait for God's timing. He didn't do it. He just took the Hagar. In the case of Sarai, she should ask God what to do as the mother of the future big nation's mother. She is not mother yet, but God promised that she will become a future big nation's mother. In the case, she has to ask God how to do it, make it possible. However, Abram and Sarai didn't do them. So when we act something to fulfill God's will based on his promise, here is our Christian's effort. We want to fulfill God's will. Okay, that is very, very good. However, we have to consider the details also to know the ways and timing. So details, what did God say? Because God is very careful God. He teaches us details. So we have to pay attention to his details. So number one is what? Did he teach him to do this one? We have to discern it. How? Did he say to accomplish it in this way? We have to ask God and ourselves. Did he say to me to do it now, later, or continually? For example, if God told you, okay, become a doctor, so what we have to do, study now or later, or continually I become a doctor? And how we will study, how we will earn the budget to study, for what we have to be a doctor. So details we have to know. And second part is, my question is, who is precious in God's eyes? So we have four options in here. You can choose the answer from these questions, okay? So who is precious in God's eyes? Number one, Abram. Number two, Sarai. Number three, Hagar. Number four, Ismail. Who do you think precious in God's eyes? Abram is the very important person who make a covenantal relationship with God. That's why maybe Abraham is most important. How about Hagar? She is a servant. About Ismail, the son between Abraham and Hagar. How do you think who is most precious? I can say that all of them. Not just Abraham or Sarai. They are very important. Yes, it is true. To accomplish God's will, Abram and Sarai very important. But Hagar, though she is a servant, she also very, very precious in God's eyes. Of course, his son or her son also. So let's see the extent of God's care. Verse 11, and the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ismail, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. This situation is that Sarai got angry with Hagar. So she abused the Hagar. That's why Hagar ran away and she cried alone. At the time, the angel talked to her. Behold, you are pregnant, shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Hagar was in despair because her mistress abused her. That's why she ran away and cried in despair. At the time, God talked to her. So, after God's comfort, Hagar confessed like this. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. She confessed that God looks after her. She could feel that God takes care of her. Can you say that Hagar also precious in God's eyes? Amen, of course. So extent of God's care, let's think about that. Everyone, regardless of social position, gender, race, or age, regardless of any condition, everyone is precious in God's eyes. God cares for everyone, so he can hear every cry, every sorrow. Of course, he can hear every joyful thanksgiving. He comforts us. He protects us. He plans our path also. God planned great thing for Abram. However, he also made a plan for Hagar and Ishmael, her son. That is the extent of God's care. Everybody is very precious in God's eyes. You are in God's arm. As God listened to Hagar's cry and comforted her with the words of promise, He hears us and treats us with great empathy and compassion. So cheer up, because you are also very precious in God's eyes. God also have a plan for you. Let's remember. Remember God's promise in details, because we take any action to fulfill His promise. Number 2, walk with God in the course of accomplishing His promise. Don't use our own strategy. We should walk with God to fulfill His promise. Number 3, all of us are precious in God's eyes. And trust God cares for you. Faithing forward. God is looking at you, take care of you. You are also precious. Let's fulfill God's will as we walk with God. Thank you very much.